This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute, welcoming you to our first Security Studies Roundtable of the Fall 2014 season. On September 17th, Dr. Adam Chapnick of Royal Military College addressed the roundtable on the theme, Does Canada Really Need a Defence Policy?
Thank you very much, Chris. I think the introduction tells you that I went to school for a very long time, and if you have children, grandchildren, nephews, or nieces who have trouble sleeping, I've written lots of material that will be very helpful to you. You can read it to them, they'll do fine. When I first started a dialogue with another place that I speak occasionally about giving a lecture on Canadian defence policy, the gentleman I was speaking to said, well, does Canada even need one? And that became the basis of the idea for this talk. With an audience like this, I don't think it's necessary to suggest that Canada probably needs a defence policy. But what I do need to suggest is that, generally speaking, people who are familiar with defence issues, either because they wore a uniform, familiar with they have family who wore a uniform, or they've been following these issues for years, generally speaking, they have difficulty articulating the real basis of why a defence policy is needed to those who aren't interested in these issues, who aren't familiar with these issues, and who would prefer, quite often, to see the resources put into defence, put into other things. So my goal isn't just to suggest, yeah, well, we probably need one, you can go home now. It's much more to break down how a non-military person might understand Canadian defence policy. And although I teach at a military institution, I have no military background. I didn't even know ranks until I got to work, and I had to put the ranks up on a board so I could keep track of which students were senior to others, because hierarchy matters in the military. I had to learn that as well. So I'm coming at this as a public policy analyst, trying to explain to you how defence policy fits into the greater political conversation. And to do that, I want to divide what I'm going to say into 6 sections. 6 sections that are really based on first principles. The first one is, what is Canadian defence policy really all about? What is it? The second one is there a recipe for Canadian defence policy? What do you do to achieve your defence policy goals? So what's it about? What's the recipe? Number 3, what are the national constraints that make defence policy difficult? And number 4, very briefly, is what I'm saying consistent with Canadian defence policy in history? So what's it about? What's the recipe? What are the constraints? Does history back up what I'm trying to say? And then I want to finish with two shorter issues that I think are very important for this audience. First of all, what are 2 critical myths about Canadian defence policy that should be shattered before any deeper analysis? There are 2 myths I suggest we hear all the time, and particularly from a civilian point of view, they are not helpful to discussions of defence policy. And finally, I'll outline for you what I see as the 4 critical challenges of Canadian defence policy going forward. I'm happy to take questions much more broadly than that as we go on. So to start then, starting with the basics, what is Canadian defence policy really all about? Most, not all, but most national security analysts will agree that a state's defence policy should flow from its foreign policy, and that a state's foreign policy should reflect the state's national interests. So a state has national interests form a foreign policy. Out of that foreign policy come a number of other policies, one of which is defence. We could debate Canada's national interests forever, but there are, I would suggest to this audience, at least 2 that are relatively indisputable. So let me start there, and then I'll add 2 more that are only somewhat controversial. If we can agree, even just for the next 45 minutes, on these interests, then understanding the rest of the Canadian defence policy should be fairly straightforward. So interest number 1, national security. I think it's quite difficult to argue that it's in a state's interests to be both secure from external attack and from internal conflict. If you have to be secure from external attack and internal conflict, then a primary goal of Canadian defence policy has to be to defend Canada. You, generally speaking, would want to be able to do that through some sort of armed forces. You hope you don't have to need them, and a defence policy is largely working when you don't need your armed forces to be doing much. You still need to have them. And the armed forces also have to be able to provide aid to the civil power in times of domestic violence or natural disasters. So we start with the interest in national security. You're probably going to need an armed forces for that. Second interest that's relatively indisputable is economic prosperity. We can all define it differently, but generally speaking, there'll be an agreement that it is in a state's interest to be economically prosperous. In the case of Canada, when approximately 2/3 of our trade is with the United States, and when over 40% of our economy is dependent on foreign trade, not to mention geography, and the last 200 years of quite miraculously positive history with our neighbor, it follows that from an Ottawa point of view, there is a sense that being part of a cooperative continental economic relationship includes doing one's part to defend North America. So you defend Canada because you have a national security interest. You defend North America because it is an economic bloc that helps you prosper economically. You can't just defend Canada to defend the North American economy. So these are the two critical challenges. The analysts often call them Canada's strategic imperatives. Number one, defend Canada. Number two, defend North America. They're strategic imperatives. You can't not do those. Then it gets a little bit murkier. Third national interest I would suggest to you for Canada is a stable world order. This is not a national interest of everyone. I would suggest to you that Mr. Putin actually prefers an unstable world order. You can get away with a lot more when the world isn't stable. Populations are willing to accept things they won't accept when the world is stable. But a country that survives and prospers based on economic trade needs a stable world order. One, because when order is not stable, borders close. And when borders are closed, you can't sell. The predictability that comes from a stable world order, in addition, allows you to divert money from security to other things that keep a liberal democratic populace happy. So stable world order is helpful in terms of trade. It's helpful in terms of stability and prioritization. Now, whether you are from the left or the political right, generally speaking, both sides will agree that the world isn't fair the way it is. Political left will say, the world isn't fair, it's tilted in favor of Western liberal democratic states, we set up a system that privileges us, as a result, we have a duty in Canada to help those who are left behind. We have a moral duty. Political right is more likely to say, the world is not fair, it is tilted in favor of Western liberal democratic states, and it's in Canada's interest that it stay that way. Therefore, we have a similar duty to protect the system as it is. Political left wants to protect the system to protect the weak. Political right wants to protect the system to maintain what we have. Either way, whether you look at this from the left or the right, in terms of defense policy, Canada has an interest in contributing to international peace and stability. Whether you want to do that to help people in need or you want to do that to help yourself, either way you want to do it. So peace and stability becomes a national interest. Fourth, and again, now I'm stretching a little bit, would be a positive international reputation. Most analysts today will concede that the exercise of power in the international context is not just about guns and bombs. If it was, the United States, which accounts for more than 40% of the world's military spending, would get what it wanted all the time. Because power is about more than that. We coined the term soft power. The idea that you want to try to be able to get others to do what you want them to do voluntarily, without the coercive use of force. If soft power matters, one of the things that gives you soft power is a good international reputation. It's a lot easier to convince people of things when they feel they owe you something or when they want to do something for you. From a defense policy point of view, the way that you build an international reputation that is positive is, first, you contribute to international peace and stability. That generally helps. And or you serve as a reliable ally. And you're considered reliable by your most powerful friend and influential friends. So you want to help preserve international stability and serve as a reliable ally. It would be nice if those two are always one and the same. They aren't always, but you do want to try to do both. Now, I would suggest that a stable world order and a good international reputation are very nice to haves. They're extremely helpful. They're very important for Canada, but not quite as critical as national security and economic prosperity. They are what I would therefore call strategic choices. I happen to think they're extremely good strategic choices. But we have two strategic imperatives: national security, economic prosperity, and then we have a strategic choice, contributing to international stability. How much of that strategic choice we choose to engage and embrace will depend on things like the state of the Canadian economy, the state of the political climate in Canada, what our allies are asking us for. We're always going to defend Canada, we're always going to defend North America, and then we're going to have a choice as to how much more we do abroad. That is, in summary, Canadian defence policy. Defend Canada, defend North America, do something abroad. If that's the policy, if that is the basic principles of the policy, how do you do that practically? How do you operationalize that policy? At risk of oversimplifying, I'd suggest to you there are 3 steps. Number 1, you build and sustain a national defence capacity. You have to be able to do things. Number 2, you build and sustain reliable international relationships. You need friends. And number 3, you manage the relationship with the United States extremely carefully. So, capacity, international friends, and the relationship with the United States. So let me start with defense capacity. It would be extremely difficult to defend Canada and North America and contribute to international peace and security without a well-trained professional military. Historically, because we've had divisive conscription or compulsion debates in this country during both of the world wars, that military in Canada will always be made up of volunteers. There is too much historical baggage to suggest that we would implement some sort of draft in this country. In Canada, based on our Constitution, it's the government, meaning the cabinet, and we can debate whether this is a good idea or not, but it is the cabinet that determines how and where our Canadian Armed Forces will be employed. That seems to be somewhat evolving right now, but for now it is still cabinet's decision. So we have to have a military, it has to be voluntary, and right now it's going to be charged by cabinet on behalf of the Crown. Building supportive international relationships, and this is where non-defense people and defense people often come into a bit of conflict. Civilians with no exposure to defense sometimes, particularly from a certain political persuasion, will say, well, why can't we just be neutral? Wouldn't that work out well and simplify a lot of our problems? I would suggest to you that the idea of neutrality sounds much better in theory than it does practically, and here's how I'll explain it. We have a voluntary Canadian military. We have budgetary constraints. We have an exceptionally low population density in the country, meaning that my backyard here in Toronto is, although it's not that big, is significantly larger than the average person's backyard in the vast majority of countries in the world. We have lots of space here, which means we have more to defend and fewer people to do it. When you have that, and you have the presence of the world's greatest military power on your southern border, forgetting what kind of relationship we have, you are vulnerable. We do not have the people to defend all of the land, to defend all of the airspace. We just don't have the numbers. And some have argued that, well, the solution then is not to pick any fights with anyone. If we stay out of the way, that will protect our vulnerabilities. Neutrality, however, isn't about staying out of the way in that sense. Neutrality is actually an active decision, not a passive one. Neutrality means that you have to have enough military strength to deter anyone else from violating that neutrality. Most analysts will be clear that the only way to do that is to actually develop and sustain a greater military. You've got to be strong enough that no one will challenge what you're doing. In Canada's case, that would mean a military strong enough to deter both the United States and Russia. And that's just not going to happen here. One might consider, some might argue, well, Mexico is relatively neutral. Doesn't that prove you can do it differently? And my suggestion would be that it looks good right now, and some may be willing to take the risk. But if there were to be a military crisis in Mexico that affected the United States' interests, I'm not confident that the United States would necessarily respect the sovereignty of Mexico. I have no reason to. if that were the case in Canada right now, I would suggest the United States would be much more likely to respect the sovereignty of Canada because of the confidence that Canada has built a system capable of managing the problems here. With all of this in mind, with neutrality probably not working that well, because we have neither the political will or the capacity to build a military strong enough and a defense system strong enough, it probably makes sense for Canada to have friends and allies that it can count on. So friends and allies are helpful. That doesn't mean, of course, that the state can't develop a reputation for impartiality, which is profoundly different from neutrality, and in the civilian world is mistaken one for the other all the time. Impartiality simply says that you avoid bias when you're trying to understand a conflict. In other words, you don't always assume that your allies are correct no matter what. You're capable of saying, you are my ally, I stand by you, and I disagree with that particular decision, but in the grand scheme, I still back you. We can argue over whether Canada should be impartial on all issues, on whether Canada should be impartial on some issues, over whether Canada should ever be partial at all. That is a different debate. But it is not a debate about neutrality. It's a profoundly different worldview. No need to be neutral to be capable of impartiality. So if I get rid of neutrality, the next question that must be asked is, should Canada have a preference for alliances or coalitions of the willing? Two different ways of having friends. Do you focus on the alliances or the coalitions of the willing? Assuming, of course, that Canada is going to be cooperative in terms of how it approaches conflict. I would suggest that the answer to this question is very straightforward. And the answer is alliances are always better. You still may be involved in coalitions of the willing, but alliances are always better. And here is why. In coalitions of the willing, you have an ad hoc process. They are brought together because of a conflict that is there or because of a crisis. That's by definition without significant planning. The rules of the coalition, the rules of the game are made up as you go along. You figure that out as things happen. And generally speaking, in a coalition, those who are a greater part of the coalition will therefore make up more of the rules. Given the size of Canada, we are rarely going to be the ones making up the rules. Moreover, in a coalition, if you can't operate interoperably, you're going to be excluded. If you can't contribute because you don't have the right kit, if you can't contribute because you haven't trained with these other states before, you're no longer at the table. On the other hand, in an alliance, everyone has a say in setting up the rules of the game. People train and practice together so they are interoperable. And what that means is that there are greater opportunities for the smaller states to actually have a voice, to actually have a seat at the table, to make sure that their interests are considered when alliances are making decisions. So when given the choice, for a small state like Canada with a limited-sized military, alliances are much more are preferred. They're much more ideal. Assuming that alliances are a good thing, the next question to ask is, well, do you want collective defense alliances or collective security alliances? Which one would you want to privilege? And to differentiate for you, to clarify, United Nations is a collective security alliance. The United Nations, with a vote of the Security Council, can actually engage in preventive or proactive work abroad. Whereas NATO, in its original intent, in its original formulation, was purely an alliance of collective defense, which meant that NATO's military power was not engaged unless there was a direct attack on one of its members. So collective defense, you only engage when your members are attacked. Collective security, you engage based on a set of common norms. I would suggest in this case, there's no right answer. Canada needs both. In the ideal world, collective security and relying on a group like the United Nations would be ideal. Since the United Nations has not proven capable of being particularly quick in its ability to respond to certain types of crises, even the UN Charter itself has made room for regional alliances that are capable of stepping in if the UN isn't ready. So you need collective defense alliances as well as collective security alliances. It makes sense to be part of NATO and to be part of the United Nations. So you need a military capacity in this recipe. You need your alliances, deal with your ad hoc coalitions of the willing sometimes, collective security alliances, collective defense, and step 3, manage the relationship with the United States. And I'd suggest there are two parts when it comes to defense policy to managing the relationship with the United States. The first is what some analysts call preserving defense against help. And defense against help is a wonderful concept. It's meant to capture how successive Canadian governments have confronted the challenges associated with securing North America alongside the world's preeminent military power. And the theory goes like this. Typically, if a state realizes that its defense forces are not capable of resisting attack from the superior forces of a neighboring state, so you're beside a bigger neighbor, and if they felt like walking all over you, there's nothing you could do about it. Typically, you have three options. Option one is called the self-help option. You build your military up until you can deal with it. So you could do self-help. Option two is the borrowed help option. You rely on the forces of other states to help you. You join alliances, or you even make yourself subservient to another state when it comes to defense. So there's self-help, there's borrowed help, and then option three typically is helplessness. You just close your eyes and hope they don't attack, because you don't want to invest in self-help or borrowed help. None of self-help, borrowed help, or helplessness describes Canada all that well. Yes, some defense critics will say it's really helplessness, we haven't done nearly enough. But in the grand scheme, Canada has invested somewhat in its armed forces. It does have a defense capacity. It has joined NATO. But it's still not enough to be out there on its own. So what is Canada doing? What it is trying to do, according to the theory, is build up enough strength that your allies, or that your neighbor looks at you neither as a vulnerability or as a threat. So you want to be strong enough that the Americans don't feel they have to violate your sovereignty to deal with problems, but not so strong that they start looking at you differently. You're defending against American help that you don't want, because it would challenge your sovereignty. Canadian defense policy requires an approach of defense against help. You can't just not defend at all if you want to keep your sovereignty. You don't have to have the biggest military in the world, because that would actually hurt you, because it would threaten the United States. So you defend, and how much? Enough that the United States feels no obligation to help, but not so much that it feels an obligation to hurt. So that's part of this manage the U.S. relationship. The other part is preserve the credibility of the specialness of the relationship. In this day and age, I teach at Canadian Forces College. We have 1/4 of our student body are international students coming from all countries around the world, and a good 50% of them tell us that they have a special relationship with the United States. Everyone today has a special relationship. Great Britain does, France does, Israel does, Canada likes to say it does, Australia certainly thinks that it does too. But I would suggest from a defense policy point of view, Canada's relationship is actually special, and it's important that it stay that way. And it's special because of NORAD, responsible for aerospace warning, aerospace control, maritime warning to support the defense of North America. Unlike any other two-country cooperative military relationship in the world, NORAD is binational as opposed to bilateral. That means that both states report not just up through their own chains of command, but also through a joint chain that can be led by a national of either state. In other words, to be blunt, NORAD is the organization that the United States belongs to, through which Washington has openly accepted the possibility of working under a non-American mission commander in a time of conflict on North American soil. There is no other situation like that in the world. There's no other country the United States would allow to be in charge during a conflict on North American soil other than a Canadian deputy commander of NORAD. That's special. That's different. Since American strategic culture is largely offensive, however, nuclear deterrence is pushing outwards, projection of conventional force abroad pushes outwards, it's an offensive culture. Some experts have said that this special relationship is special but not important. And I can accept that, special but not particularly important to the United States. Nonetheless, from a Canadian defense policy point of view, and from a diplomatic point of view, it remains critical. You need to be able to remind the Americans that you are to be treated differently than everyone else, particularly given the discrepancy in power. You do that by keeping NORAD viable. If you buy everything I've said, then defense policy should be fairly straightforward. You build up enough of a military, you make friends, you join alliances, you manage Canada-US relations. Why can't we all just agree and move on? Let me talk to you about 2 levels of constraints, and 5 constraints in particular that hamper the ability to pursue defense policy with ease. 4 of them refer back to what I'd call Canadian strategic culture, and 1 of them comes back to the premise that you need alliances. So, number 1 of 5, strategic culture, Canadians' feelings of security. The cognitive scientists call this availability bias. And what availability bias means is that, generally speaking, people perceive what is immediately around them to be the reality. And it follows that if I live in a town in Canada where there is no military presence, where there has been no attack on my soil in over 200 years, perhaps in over 300 or 400 years, I assume that the world is perfectly safe. Because my bias is to my surroundings, it makes sense to me to believe that if I'm safe, everyone's safe. And if everyone's safe, why do I need defense? There's no threat. It makes perfect sense that people who are in the defense industry, follow defense, or wear a uniform will perceive a profoundly different world order than people who don't. Their availability bias is profoundly different. They're exposed to conflict far more often. They've seen what wars can cause. As a result, there's a cognitive disconnect. And that cognitive disconnect makes it harder to explain to the Canadian public why you need to have defense at all. You haven't been attacked, you think you're safe, and you have every reason to based on how the brain works. One way that analysts have gone about explaining what Canada does because of this availability bias is pursue an approach to defense policy called how much is just enough. How much is just enough not to upset our allies, but not so much that the public starts to get nervous. How much is just enough to give us a seat at the table in the discussions, but not so much that we're going to take criticism at home. How much is not just enough to back up what we're saying on the world stage, but not so much that we might take too many casualties. So availability bias, Canadian strategic culture, feelings of security matter. They're a constraint. Second constraint, also part of Canadian strategic culture, civilian ignorance of the defense establishment. Civil-military relations get really difficult, I would suggest, when the people in charge of defense policy have little to no military expertise or experience. This isn't a recipe for smooth sailing. It is consistent with the Westminster tradition. It's consistent with the way our liberal democracy works, but it's not ideal if the world was only about defense policy. It at times can result in what analysts call the commitment capability gap. Since military is no-fail, and no matter what we ask them to do, they find a way, we can ask them to do whatever we want. They'll figure it out. We can commit them as much as we want, regardless of the capabilities that we give them. We have had times in Canadian history where this has been the case, where we've overcommitted without providing the capabilities. I'd suggest to you if you had more expertise in defense making decisions, that might not happen as much, but there'd be a trade-off there. You would lose expertise in somewhere else. This problem also goes the other way around. Military representatives who are faced with civilians who don't know much about the military are prone to argue for what we often say in the civilian world, a Cadillac, when all you need is a Chevrolet. If I can't judge what secure means, if I don't know how your kit works, you can tell me you need the very best when you don't necessarily need it. You don't have to differentiate between what I'd like to have and what I actually need, because I, the civilian, don't know the difference. So civilian-military disconnect hurts on both sides. As a civilian, I might ask the military to do too much. Military might ask for things they don't need. So that's a problem. So that's 2 problems. Third problem, again part of Canadian strategic culture, partisan politics. Liberal democracies have elections approximately every 4 years, which lead to changes in government. And other than perhaps the province of Alberta, where they're even proven that might go wrong soon, we don't generally re-elect the same political party over and over and over again. Which means that if political parties do not agree on the national interests or the national goals to pursue those interests, defense policy will change far more regularly than it should to be strategically meaningful. This can be really problematic when it comes to certain elements of policy implementation, and particularly procurement, where we can start a process based on one government's conception of the national interest, and we can cancel it before we've completed it based on a new government's conception of the national interest. Now, there is a way around this that some people propose, and they suggest that the way you get around this is get all of the political parties to agree on the broad strokes of international relations. Generally speaking, I've suggested to you, and I will again when I look at the history, Canada's interests don't change. If we could all just accept that, based on the fact that the United States will always be our neighbor, based on the fact that our population density will always be low, we'll never be able to defend the entire North America. If we could all just agree to some basic facts, we could probably find a defense policy that we could keep relatively consistent for a long period of time. Less partisan. Some people like this, think it's a good idea. Even if not entirely possible, they've come close in Australia. The response, however, is that the problem with this approach is that it leaves nobody accountable. If all political parties agree on Canadian defense policy and something goes wrong, who do you blame? Who do you punish in the liberal democratic system? Who do you hold to account? This comes back to the debate that we're often having right now over whether the government should allow Parliament to vote on whether we send troops to Iraq. Well, if we all vote, and we all vote together, then we've lost, according to some experts, the right to hold everyone else to account. If we support it, now we're part of it. So while some say we need less partisanship, others say actually we need that partisanship, as destructive as it might be, because we need the accountability that comes along with it. There's no right answer here. There's always a disagreement, but it's clearly important to understand both sides. So that's 3 problems so far. Problem 1, Canadians feel very secure. Problems 2, civilians and military don't understand each other. Problem 3, partisan politics. Problem 4 or 5, domestic, national politics, inter-party politics. So long as elected officials want to run for office again, there is always the risk that domestic political priorities will cause governments to make issues on national defense. The one I will bring up, even though a member of the party was there at the time, I'll bite my tongue and say ballistic missile defense. Sometimes these decisions are made for the wrong reasons, even when the United States doesn't ask for a decision. That's the nature of domestic politics. And I wouldn't want to wish that away, because it would be wishing away liberal democracy. What's important to recognize is that it is a constraint. It is a constraint that is there that will prevent an ideal defense policy. That's one of the prices that you pay in a liberal democratic system when elections matter. 5th and final problem is less about strategic culture. It's about the constraints and obligations of alliance members. If you're going to accept that you can't do everything yourself, you also have to accept that the alliance won't always do everything exactly the way that you want it to. That the coalition of the willing may have a slightly different approach to problem solving than you would if you were acting on your own. It's a sacrifice that is a cost that must be taken if you're not going to be working alone. And in the Canadian context, that is always the case. We aren't going abroad alone. One of the costs there is that we aren't necessarily pursuing what we would feel to be the ideal plan when we go. And it simply has to be factored into the equation. So the final cost. With all of that in mind, does what I've said play out in history? And in my, even as a historian, I shudder to say in my 2-minute history lesson, I would suggest the answer is yes. Look at the 1940s and 1950s. I call it ramping down and ramping up. Second World War ends. Canada has among the 4 most powerful militaries in the world. By 1947, however, the same military has been reduced to 35,000 active personnel. But then the Korean War comes in 1950 and everything changes. Defense expenditures move from under $800 million to almost $2 billion in less than 2 years, accounting for close to 50% of the federal budget. And defense remains the largest federal expenditure for about a decade. Personnel increased from that 35,000 to 104,000 in less than a decade. Canada's national interests during the period don't actually change. There is no broad shift in defense policy, even though these massive changes take place to the size of the military and the military budget. The interests are the same. 1960s, period of transformation. an era also where government attempts to increase social spending and shift the emphasis of the federal budget. The budget is trimmed, yes, unification is achieved, whether that's good or bad, whether the services like it or not. Defense policy still doesn't change. Canada has the same allies, it's a member of the same alliances, it pursues the same basic priorities. The 70s and 80s, I call it Canada First, the original, because it's Trudeau, not Mr. Harper, who first said we're going to put Canada first. Initially suggests he's going to reduce the commitment of Canadian forces to Europe by 100%, ends up reducing it by 50%, emphasizes less peacekeeping, more focus on Canada. Over time, he does what a couple of historians have called a pirouette, comes right back to Pearsonianism. Regardless, the relative Canadian defense priorities don't change. Defend Canada, defend North America, do something abroad. The talk might be different, the number of dollars might be different, but the defense policy in general is quite similar. 1990, some people call it the decade of darkness. Regardless, the budget goes down to $9 billion, force decreases from 80,000 to 60,000, but the Canadian forces decide to maintain a skeletal, combat-capable force, which makes it possible to scale up in the future if the numbers change. And the priorities don't change. It's still defend Canada. It's still defend North America. And when you can, do the occasional thing abroad. 21st century, we get renewal, more money available, but the main priorities still don't change. They remain the same. So this could look complicated to some, but when you dig down deep, the Canadian priorities have been very consistent, regardless of government, regardless of the amount of spending. We just do more of some of it or less of some of it, and we may explain it differently. We generally come back to the same place. With that in mind, it's important, I think, to dispel a couple of key myths that I think that some of you might find controversial, but that I think really hurt discussions of defense policy, which shouldn't be that complicated, at least in the Canadian context. Number one, the idea that is spread quite often, at least implicitly, that the more Ottawa invests, the more secure Canadians will feel. Spend more, Canadians will feel safer. Why do we have to spend more? To make Canadians feel safer. This idea sounds good at the very basic level, and democratic governments typically increase funding for security when the public perceives its security to be more at risk. Yes, we ramp up spending after 9/11. We feel less secure. We spend more. What we end up in is what one analyst has called, however, the homeland security dilemma. The homeland security dilemma is as follows. The harder a government tries to make its people feel safe, the higher the bar will be set for what feeling safe means. You try to make me feel safer, I'll assume that there's a saferness to feel, and I will demand even more in terms of feeling safe, because I can never feel 100% safe. So if you expose me to a greater potential, I will expect more, and I will continue to expect more, no matter how much you spend, because there is no limit. You can keep spending, I still won't feel totally safe, and since I've seen you spend more before, I'll assume you could spend more on top of that. So, yes, we should spend on security, but the idea that we must instinctively increase whenever we feel insecure is misleading. We must spend based on our needs and priorities, not based on a desire to make people feel differently, because it won't work. Number two, idea often plays out the suggestion that cuts to national defense will lead to, quote unquote, a Canada without armed forces. 2004, a number of expert defense analysts, some of you might be here, published a collection of essays called Canada Without Armed Forces. Canada, in a few years, they wrote, will be effectively disarmed. These same authors, 5 years later, were writing about what a great job the Canadian Armed Forces were doing in Afghanistan. 2004, they said, we've passed the point of no return. Armed forces are finished. 5 years later, Canada's doing a brilliant job in Afghanistan. What I am trying to suggest here is not that we can cut and there will be no impact. My suggestion is that historically, defense advocates have cried what the civilian community would consider to be wolf far too many times. You can't always be in crisis and then miraculously pull out of it before I stop defining what you're saying as a crisis. You can only say so many times we're finished and then come back and surprise me before I don't believe you anymore. You can only cry wolf one time, and my hope is that you never do, because if you do, I'm in real trouble. So I think we have to, in the defense community, watch our rhetoric. When we push too far, we discredit ourselves, because the Canadian Armed Forces come through over and over and over again. They always have. So 2 myths: Homeland Security dilemma and Canada without armed forces. So I want to finish very briefly with the 4 challenges that I see in the future. Number 1, all over the news every day, including today, managing Canada's veterans. Afghanistan has resulted in a disproportionate number of injured vets, both physically and psychologically, something that was always there but we didn't really track very well until the last couple of decades. I would suggest that the costs and challenges associated with the physical and mental health of our veterans from Afghanistan, they're only starting right now. We're not there yet. We're calling it a crisis right now. I don't know what we'll call it in 10 years when real PTSD continues to hit and the effects are truly seen. So that's a problem. Second challenge, the question of privatization of security. We're going to continue to have discussions over what elements of national defense can be privatized and what elements are critical to keep in-house. And the implications of those discussions will have a significant impact on how defense policy is made and conducted for the generations to come. Does the military cook have to be from the military? Some civilians say, well, it's easy. The answer is no. How about the people protecting our aid workers? Civilians have a bigger problem with that one. Do you really want a private company protecting your own diplomats or your own aid workers? These are hard conversations. We're going to keep having them. We have to be ready for them. Number 3, procurement in an era of rapid technological change and slow economic growth. Explaining how procurement works to the civilian world, in my opinion, should be the top priority of just about every public communications official in the Department of National Defense. If the civilian world understood that you can't just purchase half a helicopter, that you're either in for the whole helicopter at its large price tag or you don't buy it at all, our debates would be much more informed. That if you only buy 2 of these things, you can't really use them, you need 12. That it's either 12 or 0. Civilians don't understand this. Nobody tries to get them to understand this. Until that effort is made, we will have controversy. The overly optimistic budgets that are always proposed, we can fix that. We can be far more conservative in our budgetary estimates for the cost of kit. We can be far more conservative about how many delays we think there are going to be before we actually get something built. We can absolutely do better there. And that's fixable very easily. But we can't continue to ignore the need to explain how procurement works to the broader Canadian public. There's too much money at stake. And finally, managing Canadian Armed Forces personnel. And I use management rather than recruitment so that I can also include retention, which is a far more efficient way of keeping your numbers high. Both recruitment and retention, I would suggest, are and will remain critical challenges of the Canadian Forces moving forward. So 4 issues: veterans, privatization, procurement, and management of CAF personnel. With that in mind, I come back to the basics. It's all about defend North America, defend Canada, defend North America, do as much as you can, politically feasibly, and within costs abroad. I'll leave it there to take any questions you might have.
All right.
This concludes today's webcast. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for listening. You can keep up with coming events at the RCMI by visiting our website at www.rcmi.org. We hope you'll tune in again, and we hope to see you in person at coming events. Thank you and goodbye.